This session is sponsored by the Modern Slavery Coalition, a member-driven group of leaders who are looking at ways to solve the modern slavery concerns in the infrastructure sector. This masterclass will expand on modern slavery as a particular procurement risk, presenting the work and findings of the ISC Modern Slavery Coalition, and introducing the new Modern Slavery IS rating guidance. Human rights abuses, child labour and modern slavery are a reality in some parts of the infrastructure supply chain. The procurement function has evolved to include the identification and mitigation of these and many potential harms to people throughout the development of new assessment, remediation, training and grievance systems. As I said, modern slavery exists in the infrastructure sector, but together we can create a solution. It needs to be addressed across all organisations. It's just not one issue for one business area. This panel will discuss practical tools for considering your workplaces. And joining us, Vanessa Parham, who is the General Manager, Group Procurement and Strategic Sourcing at Young Group. She will be your moderator. Alexander Coward, Senior Advisor at Pillar 2. Alexandra Monson, Group Manager for Sustainability at Ventia. Sebastian Connolly, Sustainability Procurement Manager at Transurban. And Carsten Brindle, who is the General Business Engagement Advisor, Anti-Slavery Task Force at the Catholic Archdiocese of Sydney. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel.
Thank you, everyone, and listen, thanks for coming along. This is such an important topic that we want to talk to you today about. Hopefully you've all survived the rain and for making the effort to get here, so thank you. I want to start at probably the easiest starting place today before I throw to the panel, and I just wanted to start with a definition of what is modern slavery. When you use the word modern slavery, it does conjure up certain images in your mind. So what I'm going to do is just read the definition of modern slavery that is part of the Modern Slavery Act of 2018, Australia's Modern Slavery Act. The Act defines modern slavery as including eight types of serious exploitation: trafficking in persons, slavery, servitude, forced marriage, forced labour, debt bondage, deceptive recruiting for labour or services, and the worst forms of child labour. The worst forms of child labour mean situations where children are subjected to slavery or similar practices or engaged in hazardous work. And if I can use the summary version of what is modern slavery, the term modern slavery is used to describe situations where coercion, threats or deception are used to exploit victims and undermine or deprive them of their freedom. So I think a good starting place today, and Carsten, I'll throw to you around the word modern slavery. Is there anything modern about slavery, Carsten?
No, there's nothing modern about slavery. It's the same thing that's been going on for millennia. Calling it modern slavery is, in my opinion, perhaps a bit of a misnomer. It's slavery, and it always was, and it remains the same.
It remains the same. So maybe, Sebastian, it's interesting that we're actually here having a discussion about modern slavery. I would have suggested 2 or 3 years ago we wouldn't have been. Would you like to offer some thoughts, or you other guys, about why we're having that discussion today and perhaps around the Modern Slavery Act?
Alex is probably the right person to really talk about that. But I think I think it's the right conversation to have. It's a conversation that we as society should have had a long time ago to really take action on this. The statistics that most people probably seen is there's over 40 million people in situations of modern slavery today, more than ever before in human history. So that's that alone. And if we don't do something today, collectively, then it's only going to get worse. But
So we're really talking about modern slavery in Australian context, because the Australian government in 2018 took the view that business had an important role to play in combating modern slavery, and so the government enacted what's called the Modern Slavery Act. Many of you will be familiar with it. The 10-second recap is that large businesses and other entities in Australia must report every year on their modern slavery risks and the actions they're taking to address those. And the idea behind that legislation is that information is then available to the market, to investors, to stakeholders, and to NGOs. And perhaps later we'll talk about some of the benchmarking that's come from that. And the intent is to ensure that businesses are accountable for some of the ways that they may be managing or not managing modern slavery risks in their supply chain. So we're talking about this at one level because there's a legislative imperative, but at a second level because, as Sebastian was saying, there's also a business case now for acting on modern slavery. So businesses that meaningfully address their risks can protect against reputational harm and potential legal consequences, businesses that don't face the inverse. So there's both of those sets of reasons are really important for the discussion today.
Yeah, thank you. Catherine, if I can throw to you, I'd like us to give the audience some examples of modern slavery and potentially what I think we're all aware of what modern slavery might look internationally and overseas. But what does modern slavery look like in Australia today?
Yeah, it's obviously, like you said, there's all these images of state-sanctioned slavery where countries are hiring out their population for work elsewhere. That's also an issue we're trying to address, of course, but that's not the only picture that we need to draw. They say that it goes on right under our noses, and that is the situation. That's one of the things that we're seeing in the Catholic Archdiocese of Sydney, in the Anti-Slavery Task Force. We are working to remediate cases, and it often happens in situations where there's a high turnover of people, so it's not the typical people who are on the same site day after day. It's often people who circle through different workplaces, work locations. So that could be a tradie that comes in to do, for example, the Gibraltars. Could be a couple of days. They might be from Korea or China, which there's a lot of Gibraltars from those locations at the moment in Australia, and they circle back between different locations. And if we don't know where they're coming from, through what arrangement they're having, they're very vulnerable.
Is forced marriage an issue in Australia?
It is an issue in Australia, but you could ask yourself whether that's really part of what business can help deal with. So it is prevalent as well, yes.
Yeah, okay, cool. So what I'd like just to move over to talk about is supply chain traceability. And as part of the Modern Slavery Act, we're obviously asked to look into our supply chains and understand what our modern slavery risks are. And I guess the challenge that, and I think everyone on the panel agree, is you have your tier 1 suppliers and essentially you're contracted to them. And you probably have a fairly high degree of visibility into their operations. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But what happens after your tier 1 supplier with their supplier and their supplier and their supplier, and how do you trace back your goods and where they came from? Would one of you like to sort of speak to that? Maybe Alexandra?
Yeah, I can probably start. It's that visibility into your supply chain, and firstly, I think understanding are we looking at products and services as well. So from a large organisation with quite a broad and diverse supply chain, it's important to understand that. And we transact with our first tier, so we'll have an agreement, a contract with a supplier. But then do we have visibility beyond that as well? So it's how we engage with that contractor that we're working with, and how we engage to understand beyond them. And I think we can talk to that it's around managing the risk, but also looking at opportunity for us and for them to get that visibility, and how we can use that perhaps as a bit of a positive for us as well.
Probably a question for you, Alexandra. How do you find your suppliers respond when you start asking modern slavery type questions? How do they respond?
I think there's a how do you ask as well. So if we ask in a survey, then you get back the response to the questions that you're asking, and then what do you do with that? But when we actually do start to engage and have those discussions, I think that opens up the conversation a little bit differently. And I think there's also another level of that perhaps, I'm talking about the sustainability professional to many of you here, but we interact with our suppliers in a different way, and our subcontractors, perhaps through ongoing reviews that we have with them, maybe on site when we're planning projects. We like to talk about innovation and sort of pull out good work, ways we can work together, and perhaps that's somewhere that we can start to bring in the conversation around modern slavery, looking at the services that they provide and the materials they provide. So we're talking about it less from a sort of a negative, or we need you to provide us with this, but how can we work together to actually do something quite innovative and perhaps different to them, that they can see maybe as an advantage that can help them maybe win work elsewhere as well.
And Sebastian, what does that sort of look like in your organisation?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and each organisation is very different in how they approach risk, assessing risk and then addressing that risk and doing due diligence in the supply chain. And I think that's part of the act to look at your risks individually. We know there's a lot of public information about where those risks might sit. There's the media articles and a lot of indexes, but really it's up to each business to take on that and then go from there. And as Alexandra mentioned, it's definitely collaboration and openness, because to really understand and address those risks, you need to have an open relationship with your suppliers and your customers to really delve into those and find out where that subcontracted gyprocker might be coming in and out of your business, and asking those questions further down the supply chain.
Yeah, look, we also found in our business that you're looking for potential workers where English is not the first language, or there is no English at all, and potentially the risk factors are there, and essentially there are some fertile grounds for modern slavery. Maybe, Carsten, what are those fertile grounds that you might be looking for to determine whether there might be modern slavery risk?
Yeah, those are some of the indicators. Lack of language, overseas workers who are not necessarily aware of what their rights are, and who are perhaps not highly educated as well, because if they don't speak English and they don't know their rights, obviously they're lacking some understanding in how it works here. So there's a fair few of these type of roles where perhaps a high level of skill is not a necessary requirement to go in and work. So yeah, cleaning, security, there's many different.
So in Australia, do we have any sort of a high level of prosecution around modern slavery? How does it work here?
There's not a lot of prosecution, no.
So it's very much still hidden?
It's still very much hidden, yes. I think that I don't know, the last number I saw was something like 16 prosecution or 16 cases over a number of years, not just in one calendar year. I don't know if anybody has any more recent news. So
we're still under 30 prosecutions, and part of the challenge is as Carsten was saying, that the dynamics of modern slavery make it really difficult to run a successful criminal case. So if you have people who don't speak English well from a foreign country, the idea of participating in a criminal justice process is really intimidating. And so again, that's one of the reasons underlying the Modern Slavery Act, in saying if government and business can work together and try and address some of those risk factors before we see people caught in exploitation, then that's another tool that we can use, because as Carsten said, criminal prosecutions themselves just are not enough.
Can I just jump in here, because we at the Catholic Church we're working with remediating cases, and we have an initiative called Domus 8.7, which is about remediation, and it's about taking the approach of the victim, right? It's not just about saying here's a case and then refer it on to the federal police. What happens then is it disappears into a bit of a black hole, and nobody who wants to issue a modern slavery statement wants that information to go into a black hole. We want to be able to work with it and potentially report on it, right? So from a company perspective, there's that issue, but then there's the victim perspective as well. We say maybe the victim doesn't want to have a prosecution; they actually just want to get on with their life. How long time does it take to go through a situation like this in the criminal justice system? Years, and in the meantime, they're stuck. They can't get on. They'd like to get back onto their life, get a decent job, perhaps some compensation, get some of the payment that they're owed, and just forget about the whole thing. So it's actually really hard to convince a potential victim that we should go forward with the prosecution. It's really hard.
It's difficult. All right, so I'm just going to steer us back in terms of where modern slavery sits within an organisation. But just a funny story, which is absolutely true. At Downer, we put out some questionnaires to our suppliers, and we have a very large supply chain. And I thought it was a fairly brief questionnaire about, potential modern slavery risks in your organisation. And in terms of where modern slavery sits with the Australian public, we have a lot of very small companies. There might be your sole traders, your mum and dad companies and things like that. And some of the responses that came back from our questions around modern slavery were actually quite abusive and quite questioning and quite defensive. Some of them were so aggressive I had to refer them to our legal team to decide whether there needs to be any further action. I did not expect that. In Australia, when you ask them questions about modern slavery, that you would get that type of answer. And I don't mean just one or two. I mean tens of companies responded like that. That was, I think, incredibly disappointing, but it obviously tells us we have a long way to go. Now, modern slavery in any organisation, and I'll open it up to it. Where does modern slavery sit in an organisation? Who owns it? Who's responsible? Who's accountable? Who'd like to go first?
I'll jump in first.
Thanks, Alexandra.
I think it's probably not a one-size-fits-all for all organisations. I mean, clearly it's a procurement element, so there's procurement teams, but then there's the legal compliance element as well. So maybe there's a shared role and perhaps a shared responsibility across there. But then also, where does sustainability and potentially strategy come into that as well? That it's not, particularly if we want to move it beyond compliance, it's not just around we write a modern slavery statement, we've written that statement, and as long as nothing changes and we're not made aware of any risk or glaring issues, and we keep the same thing going, that we want to move to continuous improvement. Where can we best bring that from across multiple teams to bring that in?
Okay, where does it sit in your company, Sebastian?
Yeah, so in our organisation, we actually share the responsibility. We've got a cross-functional working group, and if you read a lot of the modern slavery statements that some of the big ASX companies have put together, they have steering committees and cross-functional governance across their business. And I think that's what we're really talking about is that collaboration internally within your business. So it's not one person's responsibility, it's everyone's collectively. And then the more people inside your business that can have those conversations outside of your business, then hopefully you start to educate your suppliers, your stakeholders, and hopefully you don't get some of those responses back from those questionnaires. And that's what it's about. It's big business trying to start to educate the supply chains and broader business.
So probably a question around, you use the word modern slavery, and it is quite an emotive topic, and it's such a serious, human rights is such a serious issue. And how do you not become, within your organisation, emotional about it, so that people take you seriously and give you the time? Because if you get all emotional and you're trying, throwing stats at people, sometimes people can back off a little bit. Any thoughts on how not to do that in your organisation to really get on the table?
I think, again, if I can start on that, I think it's really being clear on the why for the organisation and bringing senior leadership on board with the why. And I see that being on two sides. So there's understanding the why from a risk point of view for the organisation, which includes the risk to reputation, clearly, and meeting compliance obligations, but then also the other side of it, and where's the opportunity. So we talk a lot about social outcomes and aligning to delivering positive outcomes, and clearly if we're not addressing human rights in our supply chain, then are we actually contributing towards SDG 8 for decent work, and are we seeing that as an opportunity then if we deliver up our supply chain to our clients? So it's the same thing, we'll be asked those questions, and to be able to then have it as an opportunity to be seen to be strong in this area, to have a well-regarded modern slavery statement that aligns with our sustainability reporting as well. So that there is then, I suppose, the why for our clients, as well as communities and our investors as well.
That's a really good point. I've never been so popular as to, the questions around modern slavery coming from not just, it's pretty serious when your customers are questioning your credentials. But it's also extremely serious when your investors are also questioning your credentials, and they expect that you've got something to say. Any more thoughts, maybe Alex, you around the expectations of customers, investors, and community? What those expectations are?
Yeah, that business case is really important, and I think being able to articulate that within the business is really key. And so an example is as Pillar 2 prepared a report for the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors last year looking at modern slavery reporting trends across the ASX, and that was reflective of the fact that as investors they intended to go and have conversations with businesses at senior levels about modern slavery, and some of you may have been in the room for those conversations. And so as investors, as customers, those stakeholders now see modern slavery as a strategic risk, as something that there's a moral imperative to do something about, but also something where there's a real business case for action as well. And so I think there's real opportunities from that for businesses. And a simple example is even here in New South Wales, there's also a New South Wales Modern Slavery Act, and one of the things that does is impose certain conditions on New South Wales procurement. And so if you're in a position where you're talking to the New South Wales government about infrastructure work over the coming year and into the future, chances are that they'll be really interested in the modern slavery work you're doing. And if you're able to articulate your risks, explain what you're doing about them in a meaningful way, then that will help you. If you aren't, then that's going to be a more difficult conversation to have.
I know that I got called in by one of our major customers to a meeting, and I'd asked for some pre-prepared questions if I could. They weren't forthcoming with that. And so all I knew was the topic was modern slavery. That's very broad. And I remember I got on the call and there were 6 of them on the call and then just me, and just peppering questions. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that any of us or anyone out there, you can find yourself in that position where your customer calls you to account and there's nowhere to run and there's nowhere to hide. And if you don't have something to say, and if you don't have something good to say, essentially I think we'd all agree that you will get caught out. And as I said, 3 years ago we might not have been sitting here having this conversation now, but with the introduction of the Modern Slavery Act, that's changed. In terms of visibility, maybe from all of you, in terms of visibility in your organisations, are people reaching out to you? Are you being asked for comments?
I can go first. I think, and we were talking before this panel about the fact that perhaps one of the biggest achievements of the Modern Slavery Act, and there's different views about how effective it has been in different ways, but perhaps the biggest achievement is just putting modern slavery on the list of issues that the boards need to know about and engage with and businesses need to understand. And as you said, 3 years ago, we wouldn't have been talking about modern slavery. Now we are. And so I think that prominence has really increased, and it's increased across businesses.
Yeah, it's an absolute one of the top priorities for probably most of the ASX companies particularly, but reputational risk is absolutely paramount.
And I'll just add as well, and say I think anyone could get asked in the organisation, so it could be the top leaders of the organisation. So how do we ensure then that all our team are aware of broadly what the topic is, but also specifically how we're addressing it? And I think if I link it back to that sort of strategy discussion and being very clear on the why and what we're doing, so that then whoever is being asked a question, whether it's from a customer, investor, anyone external and internal as well, because it's something I think our employees and potential employees as well will ask, what are you doing about things? So we all need to be able to address that. So having the right training that covers even the basics of what do we stand for around this, as well as what we're doing, and making sure that's in our own internal training, but also potentially having that available for our supply chain as well, so that we can share the learnings that we have.
I think it's certainly a very, very visible issue at the Catholic Church as well. So obviously I'm here, and as you can see, I'm from the Anti-Slavery Task Force of the Archdiocese of Sydney. And it started about 5 years ago with Archbishop Fisher wanting to eradicate modern slavery in the supply chains of the church. And you say, what are the supply chains of the church? We're not a commercial organisation, we're not profit-driven, we're values-based, and very old organisation, of course. That initiative got so much visibility that it morphed into an Australian Catholic anti-slavery network, which is also us at the Catholic Church in Sydney. We've got 46 Catholic entities that are members of this network, and that is all because they said we all need to do something. This is high visibility. We want to be on the front foot with this. 46 members don't come based on a whim. They come because they see that this is important.
Very much so.
Big hospitals, schools, etc. Right?
Alexandra, I'll just pick up on something that you said there, essentially around being an employer of choice. I don't know if you know, the labour market around procurement and sustainability is extremely competitive at the moment. If you're trying to employ someone, get ready to have tough conversations around remuneration and various other things. But workers are looking for our positions on sustainability. It's not all about the money anymore, maybe to some. But, with COVID and things, people are looking at other things and around sustainability and how we're presenting our companies and how we're interacting with communities, sort of around where we live and work is, I think, incredibly important. Any sort of comments around that? No? No, all good. All right, I'm going to throw one in now. I don't fully know what I'm going to say. I want to talk about rapid antigen tests. I think it's quite topical. As you will know, the demand for rapid antigen tests across the globe went like this. And hands up who procured rapid antigen tests for their companies or was involved in any sort of process to procure rapid antigen tests. Anyone who's using it? Everyone in the room must have used a rapid antigen test, yeah? Everyone. You think about the millions and millions of rapid antigen tests and the very short lead time to ramp up for the delivery of those tests. Now, if you were on the other end, I know us at Downer, we ordered multiplied thousands of these tests and we were riding the supplier the whole time. When are they turning up? Why are they so late? Why are they stuck in the courier network? What's happening? Why is the manufacturing taking so long? Now, here's a very important question to ask when globally we are driving demand, and we'll use rapid antigen tests as the example. When we are all collectively driving demand, what are the potential risks around modern slavery? I'll start with you, Carsten.
Absolutely, it's a risk driver. If the supply chains are tight and it's something that comes from far away, like a lot of these RAT tests do, then it's going to drive the risk right up there.
And what does that look like? Is if a company's trying to ramp up and trying to get these tests out, and they grab additional employees, what does that look like?
It looks like that workers might not be allowed to leave the factory until the order's been produced. So they will have a daily quota or whatever, and they need to fulfill it, and they might not be able to leave the factory that they're sitting in, or go back to the dorm room and rest. So it's coercion essentially
Is there a greater risk of child labour in there as well?
I don't know if there's a specific risk of child labour in that particular supply chain. That might be a slightly different issue, I think. But it could be. I mean, it depends on which country they're coming from as well.
Yeah.
So that's related to approvals and all that kind of stuff. But it could be.
So Sebastian, I know you've got a background in textiles. In terms of, is that something that plays out in textiles as well, or what was your experience around what you saw? Obviously, that's a known focus for modern slavery, and is that legitimate?
I think if we take the theory of supply and demand and a fast response pressure, I think that's what we're talking about here. Whether it was face masks at the start of COVID, there was a bit of media attention on the human rights risks there, whether it's rubber gloves that are coming out, and it doesn't matter whether it's something that actually has a human operation, so the sewing of a face mask, or a mechanical operation such as rubber gloves being made. It's about who is the supplier, what are the risks that might be there. It could be the seafarers who are actually transporting, or the truck driver. who has to meet a deadline to get to the port. It actually could be anywhere in your supply chain, and that's why we need to understand our risks essentially as a fundamental place first, and then go in and assess those risks product by product, service by service, all of the different parts of the supply chain, because we're a customer and a supplier to everyone.
Yeah, that's important. So if I could just talk about in practical terms, so you've had a look at your supply chain, you've seen something that maybe makes you uncomfortable, or you think, I've heard some media sort of noise around that, you've seen something, and maybe Alex, you could help. Like, what do you do? What's the practical steps involved in sort of isolating that risk and understanding whether it is a real risk? So understanding inherent risk and actual risk. Sorry, that's a double-barrel question.
That is a double-barrel question. So the first thing is to make sure you've thought about it before you have to think about it. So some things that some businesses like Transurban have done is have a modern slavery response plan or remediation plan, so that you have a sense, if you come into work today and your business is on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald for particular issues, you know who you're going to talk to first, what areas of the business need to be involved, where do you go from here, and from there it's always very context specific. So as Carsten said, in some countries, in some situations, going straight to the police is not the most appropriate course of action, and so that's something you need to think through in advance. But one of the keys is always approaching it in what's going to be in the best interest of the people involved and the victims particularly, and how do you respect that. And a simple example again is if you perhaps go straight to the supplier and you say, look, I'm concerned about this, and the supplier realises that you've identified something that they've been trying to hide, that can put those people who are being exploited in more danger simply by doing that. So it becomes really complex, it becomes really tricky, and that's where collaboration and even some of the work that we're looking at through the Modern Slavery Coalition that we have as the IS Council is really important. So there's no simple answer to that double-barreled question except to say that it's hard, and one of the biggest issues and one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing, and one of the big areas of interest from stakeholders is them saying to businesses, we've had the Modern Slavery Act for 3 years, you've done 2 or 3 modern slavery statements, only 8% of you are reporting finding incidents, so what's going on? Are you not looking for it properly? Are you not responding for it properly? And how do you explain that? So that's a question to keep in mind as you're thinking about this over the coming months as well.
Can I just jump in there? So I'd like to also respond to that question. I think, first of all, I'll start with the last one, the inherent versus actual risk. I think there's a tendency to focus on the inherent risk. We need to take the next step, because the inherent risk is just a pointer, and it doesn't necessarily mean that particular risk manifests in your supply or your supply chain. So you need to validate. So what happens when you validate it? So I can share personal experience from China. I've lived for a number of years in China. I've seen many Chinese factories. I've seen children, and not everything is necessarily the way it appears. So on this particular occasion, we're visiting a factory making shoes, and there's children in the factory. Clearly they're children. They're definitely less than 15 years old, which is the minimum working age in China. What do you do? Well, first of all, you need to figure out what's the situation. Are they actually there intentionally? Are they there because of poor practices? Because the management is not aware? Because the management is another building somewhere else? What's actually going on? In this particular case, we realized that this child or these children were there because they were mostly local workers. They were bringing in their kids during school holidays. Validated, it is actually school holidays. These kids are not on the payroll. They're actually just sitting next to their parents on the production line and contributing to their parents' piece rate. So while it's wrong, it's not necessarily child labor, but when you walk in there at first glance, they tick child labor.
Children in a factory.
That's the big red light that's flashing, right?
Yeah.
So of course, then you need to help your supplier. You need to engage with your supplier, saying, is this intentional? Was it malicious? Or was it just an honest mistake? And then work with them based on what you are convinced that they're doing. Are they good or bad? And
so probably a question to follow on from that one. If you find, and probably this is something I learned from you, Carsten, if you find modern slavery in your supply chain, what's your reaction to that? Do you just naturally abort? you say, oh, I've stumbled across, there's modern slavery and maybe there's sufficient evidence that we think that, yes, maybe there is modern slavery occurring. Do you abort or do you work with the supplier and seek to remediate? What's the answer to that, Carsten?
You don't abort. That's not best practice. The best practice is to engage with the supplier and work to remediate the situation and mitigate future cases. So, and there's of course a distinction between mitigation and remediation, right? So that's the first step. But of course, you can't let it just go for years and years. So at some point in time, there has to be a consequence. All right. So at what stage that consequence is where you pull the trigger, that's very individual. I don't know if anybody else.
Any thoughts on that?
Only to second what Carsten said and say there's a whole kind of world of business and human rights principles, and one of them is the UN Guiding Principles on business and human rights, and they're a global set of principles that investors and other stakeholders will expect you to be aware of and to follow. And as Carsten said, what they say really clearly is don't cut and run from something in your supply chain, and the responsibility and the expectation is that you work and use your influence or your leverage to try and address that, and then in the future there's a potential conversation if there's no change about whether you should exit the business relationship. That should never be the first instinctive reaction.
I think that's really important, because naturally no one wants to be on the front of the financial review to say that you've been dealing with a supplier that has some modern slavery allegations, but I guess it's your response to the allegations which is incredibly important, how you respond to them. And I think, as Alex said, hopefully turning up on the front page of the financial review, it's not news to you. You should know about it way before it ends up there. And you should have your company's, processes and policies and standards all in place, and so that you are well positioned to answer any allegation that may or may not pop up in your supply chain. If I could just, I think an easy one for us to discuss is perhaps if we can discuss supply that comes out of China. A lot of us procure goods and services from China. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a company that doesn't. There are a lot of, if you have a look online and you Google modern slavery, a lot of allegations are surrounded by some Chinese companies pop up. What do you do about that? How, you've got our suppliers in China, we're here, you've read some media reports. How do you verify? How do you get the information you need to satisfy yourself, particularly when you're reporting to your company, that you have investigated? And how do you make sure your investigation is thorough enough? Who wants to answer that tricky one?
Perhaps I can start and talk a little bit about the work of the Modern Slavery Coalition, and I think important to add in as well as a policy view that China is particularly complex at the moment, and something Carsten may be able to speak further about. But there are some real legal and policy challenges that you need to be aware of and conscious of if you're engaging with suppliers in China in that context. But as part of the coalition, one of the things that we're looking at is how do you engage with suppliers in a way that's helpful and meaningful, and we've all tried the supplier questionnaire response that's come back, and it hasn't given you the information that you've needed. And so one of the first steps we took as a coalition was sharing some questionnaires with bitumen and PPE suppliers, and we engaged with them prior as well to explain why we were seeking this information. And what we got back really showed that for many of those suppliers, with some exceptions, but they were in situations where, for various reasons relating to capacity and priorities, they just weren't able to articulate to us the risks that they had and what they were doing about them. And so one of our projects has been developing a risk tool that we could share with suppliers, and we've been testing with suppliers that actually helps them go through and understand at that inherent risk category, but also in the context of their specific operations, where their risks might be, so that they can then communicate them to us as a coalition, and then work out where some of those supplier capacity gaps are. And I think one of the big lessons and one of the big areas of focus going forward, particularly in engaging with suppliers below Tier 1, is how can we actually fix the issues that are there in the first place, and that's only really possible if there's a meaningful relationship and some dialogue with the supplier, and that might need to involve the Tier 1 supplier, it might need to involve other stakeholders as well, but particularly that's where collaboration is really important. So they're just some of the challenges and opportunities that we've experienced as part of the coalition, which I think is to say that supplier engagement is really tricky, and doing it well is really tricky, particularly if you're doing it by yourself.
So Carsten, around the nuances about risk, just because something's manufactured in China doesn't make it high risk automatically. And so are you able to talk to that we need to be mindful about what actually is a high risk and where we should potentially focus? Not everybody here will have a dedicated team that manages modern slavery, and essentially sometimes you need to look at where's the best bang for my buck around modern slavery, and where are my real risks in my organisation. So Carsten, what's a real risk versus, again, something that, the media says this, but what's the real risk or the actual risk?
Yeah, absolutely correct. The inherent risk level is not necessarily the same. I think it's about validating whether your models are actually showing that the risk is like you're predicting it to be, but the way to validate that is to go and see with your own eyes.
Yep.
And I think there's a process called social audits. It's getting a bit of a bad rap at the moment because there's been a lot of issues around the accuracy of social audits. So now everybody's talking about human rights due diligence. At the end of the day, it's going to be the same people who do a due diligence review who did a social audit. So how much is going to change from it? I'm not that convinced myself that by renaming it to something else, that's going to produce a big difference. But you need somebody on the ground to go in and check. And of course, you can't go and check 1,000 suppliers because it's going to cost a lot of money to do that. So you need that inherent risk level to funnel down and see where is it we're going to apply our resources. I mean, you could also say, well, let's focus on China one year and Bangladesh the next year, or let's focus on a specific category like bitumen, like Alexander said, and then the next year we do concrete or steel or whatever it is. But it's about that validation on site. And only that will tell you whether it's a real risk or not, whether the inherent risk is correct. And I think, from my perspective, I think there's just a study last week that came out about the risk related to the distance of where the workforce is coming from. And that's my experience as well. Local-based factories with local staff, generally speaking, have better working conditions than those who hire staff in from faraway locations. So there's various different indicators that you can use to use other than just the sort of the country risk or the category risk index. So yeah, it's all about validating.
Yeah. And I guess there are tools out there that can assist you in this process. Does anyone want to speak to any of the tooling that they use, or?
Yeah, I think there's lots of tools, and there's no perfect tool. And I think actually we need, it's a sort of common phrase that talk about, one of the tools in the toolbox. And, we're talking about, public data, the Global Slavery Index to measure inherent risk, and then SAQs to really start to ask the more meatier questions of your particular suppliers. Then you start to get the gauge and what their response is. Are they transparent? Are they open? Are they not? Where does that risk start to sit? And then there's audits. And then on top of audits, there's other anonymous surveys that you can go in with worker surveys, offshore, to really get that, or attack on social training to your quality controllers to add some skills of people with their eyes in factories, and so there's lots of different tools that you can use, and I think that's the journey of assessing and addressing these modern slavery risks in your supply chain. And each business will be very different. They might have local supply, which is great. Get in there, have a look at what's happening, and if it's offshore, there might be some other tools to use.
And I think being aware as well that risk profiles change, and so a lot of companies, and you may have done a basic risk assessment a few years ago when the Modern Slavery Act came in, and in the infrastructure sector particularly, that probably didn't pick up solar panels, for example. And in the last 2 years, we've seen a real awareness and understanding of the risks around state-sponsored forced labour in solar panels, and 50% of the world's polysilicon comes from a region in a country where there's a very high prevalence of state-sponsored forced labour. And so if you bought solar panels in the last few years, you're exposed to those risks, and they may have not been picked up in that risk assessment work that you've done. So as with all of this, it's not a set and forget process that you can do once and put on a shelf somewhere. It's something that you need to keep coming back to and thinking about. And as Sebastian and others have said, there's some tools out there that can help you do that.
Okay, I am going to move to the questions now. This is the fun bit. So we have a few questions here and they're really good. So the first one is, are many infrastructure companies going above and beyond the regulatory requirements on modern slavery? If so, how? So you read some modern slavery statements and it's a little bit of a whitewash. You think, oh, what really went? So the question is, are many infrastructure companies going above and beyond the regulatory requirements? Who would like to comment on that one?
I'd probably just say, I'm not sure about the many, but the requirements are to report. So to have a look, have an understanding around your risk and report on that. But that's pretty much, you can do that and put a statement out, but are you really getting into and understanding what it looks like in your supply chain? So there are examples, and it is a good idea to look out if you are and talking to a partner, a client, a supplier, and think, do they have a statement already? So that's a good starting point to see what they have there. And there are some really good examples, I think, that we look to, and examples through the coalition, where through engaging different groups, partnering together to look at and starting out on that journey, that's a really good starting point.
Cool. Anything else? Thank you. Move to the next question.
Can I just say something as well?
Sure.
Just quickly on that one. I think instead of naming anybody that I think is really good, I'd say at the Catholic Church we're also doing an index, a benchmark of modern slavery statements. And like a lot of the other state reviews that have come out, one of the key things that everybody's saying is lack of detail, lack of metrics, and a lack of transparency, right? It's all paper promises is one of the reasons reports came out. So for me, a standout effort is one that contains metrics, is one that contains clear speak about what is the targets and how do we aim to achieve it. So I mean, anybody who can articulate those things and provide details, that's a standout effort.
Yeah, I mean, a modern slavery agreement is not meant to be advertising for your company, and sometimes when you read some modern slavery reports, you're dredging through a lot of company-related information to get to the real facts. And the government's picked up on that, so I think the first year of the Modern Slavery Act, everyone got a bit of a hall pass. On the second year, they did put out some communications in relation to what was done very poorly in the Act, and this is said around that reporting piece, and related entities. So just the notion of that, you're not on the hook just for your parent company, you're on the hook for all your related entities, and you actually have to talk to that in your report. And I think the government said that was very poorly managed.
Yes.
Okay, here's another question. Some suppliers have very limited supply chain visibility. Building supply capability is key to a successful collaboration to tackle human rights issues. How do you go about this in your business? So there's a question around having limited supply chain visibility. And so how do we get that visibility? Does someone want to jump in on that? What's your initial step to getting some visibility into your supply chain?
Yeah, I think it's sharing knowledge. So if a supplier was to come to me and said, I don't really have much visibility, or I knew there wasn't much coming back in a SAQ that I had, it's how do you deep dive with those suppliers to actually teach them about what the challenge is, what are you trying to find, and actually talking through it. I've had some experiences with suppliers in other countries who don't understand the Modern Slavery Act. They're not covered by the Modern Slavery Act. And we're trying to get information about traceability of who they're using. And it's about that communication, about educating, bringing them on the journey together. And, there are a lot of tools out there. The government has a resources section on the Modern Slavery Register with SAQs, with some tips and tricks, with clauses. So there's lots of information out there. There's a lot of learnings from other people's modern slavery statements for for businesses to take. And I think the big thing is just that collaboration, with suppliers to bring them on the journey.
And I think recognising as well the different levels and capacities of suppliers. So the coalition had a webinar particularly for their suppliers to talk about the Modern Slavery Act and what good risk management looked like. And you could really see from that the difference between some of these very small, perhaps mum and dad suppliers, they're sitting on the webinar having come in from the shop floor, and some of the more sophisticated suppliers. And so there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and really I think recognising those different levels and maturity and capacity is really key, and then working out what's the best approach in that case.
Cool. All right. So probably
I'll just add another thing.
Sure.
I think that there's another thing. It's a journey, right? And a lot of people don't like that word, that it's a journey, but it is a journey. And I think any journey starts with knowing where you want to go, right? So you need to know what are your targets, what are your goals, and only that will help you identify where to start, identify what the gaps are if you want to reach that particular target. So there's lots of help out there, definitely. But you need to define where you want to go.
All right, so the last juicy one. Can anyone give an example of an action related to an allegation in your supply chain and what that looks like? Who'd like to talk to an allegation in their supply chain?
I wouldn't say allegation specifically, but there's a lot of media publicity about risks and potential risks of modern slavery, and I think trying to dig deeper when they do come up in the media is what any business needs to do. Find out what information you already know, and then going down that tunnel of really researching it. And in previous roles, I've had to do that, and it's about investigating, and it's a tough one about do you go into your supplier and directly ask the question, because that may not be the best course of action. It may be that in some cases I've put in an anonymous survey into the supply base to try and find out from the workers what's actually happening in the factory. So it will need a nuanced approach. You'll need to think about it, how you're going to tackle it, and where in the world is it? Is it local? Is it offshore? Yeah. So really tricky, but there's I'm sure most businesses, the bigger businesses, will have a crisis management team. Will have some plans around how to react to those situations. But I think the smaller ones, take it as an opportunity. Take it as an opportunity to investigate your supply chain. It's actually a positive, because what we're trying to do is eradicate modern slavery from the world.
Yeah, and I think it's important not to try and hide an allegation. I think part of the modern slavery statements is being transparent, and if you have an allegation in your supply chain, own it, because people will find out. Investors get a hold of information, and you're much better off declaring it, investigating, and taking all the necessary steps than trying to hide something or pretend it's not happening, or just hoping no one finds out, because that defeats the whole purpose of the Act, which is to really to increase the posture of modern slavery and for us to have these conversations. So us hiding things is really anti that. So before we finish up, I might just get some final words from all of you. I know Carsten's got a great book here, everyone. There you go, Carsten. So if I could just get some final closing thoughts around maybe where you're headed in your company, what you're focused on, or even just how important this is to you. So you first, Carsten?
Yeah, so at the Australian Catholic Anti-Slavery Network, we have been working for a number of years implementing this risk management program. It is a process, and it takes a while. We have 46 entities that need to come on the journey of different levels of maturity in different industries, etc. So we're working very heavily on getting all of our suppliers onto a risk management platform called SEDEX. And then based on that, we're starting with the actual validation work of the risk and addressing it. But in parallel, we're also helping victims through our DOMS 8.7 initiative, which is it's a different story.
Thank you, Alexandra.
Thanks. I do like the word journey and describing it as a journey, and I'm really that opportunity for us around really having a core focus in our strategy and what we can do as an opportunity there, and really we mentioned before metrics, so really getting into some of the details of the metrics to take it that step further. So we start with our first tier suppliers. What's the next step from there, and how can we do that a little bit better with the use of metrics?
Awesome. Thanks. Sebastian?
Yeah, I think for Transurban it's about continuous improvement. You know, we're not the best out there at this, and I don't think that anyone is. You know, it's about doing things better tomorrow and the next day and the next day, and it is a journey, and learning from those experiences and trying innovative things. So that's what we'll be pushing for in the future.
Awesome. And Alex?
And I think we've heard a few times about the importance of collaboration, and I think as a business, thinking about that for you is really important, whether that's opportunities to go and talk to an NGO that has expertise in an area of your supply chain, or looking to partner with other businesses. And I think the Modern Slavery Coalition, as the sponsor of this panel, is a great example of some of the ways that can work in the infrastructure sector.
Awesome, thank you. So thank you to all of you today. You'll be pleased to know that I consulted with my legal team, and I did not wish them to take any further action against those nasty emails. Look, you know, anything that elevates the posture of modern slavery and human rights risks across the globe is obviously incredibly important. So thank you. If you've got any questions, please feel free to approach us afterwards. But thank you for listening today.
Thank you.